December 7th, 1943. 2 years to the very day after the skies above Pearl Harbor had been consumed by fire and smoke, a strikingly different kind of vessel quietly navigated its way into the bustling harbor of San Francisco. Its decks, far from being manned by uniformed sailors, were instead lined with a multitude of weary figures, their bodies shrouded in threadbare kimonos and coats mended countless times over. These were Japanese civilian women, some nurses, others wives of diplomats or merchants caught abroad when the brutal war erupted, and a small contingent of young women who had served in rear-line hospitals. Captured across the vast Pacific, they had been brought across the ocean under heavily guarded transport, their arduous journey marked by the constant companions of fear, hunger, and an oppressive silence. As the ship neared the docks, a wave of profound apprehension swept through the women. They steeled themselves, bracing for the grim reality they had been indoctrinated with since childhood. Americans were cruel, barbaric, and eagerly awaited opportunities to inflict suffering upon their enemies. More than one woman whispered a final, desperate prayer, anticipating a fate of chains, starvation, or perhaps even worse atrocities. The gangplank descended with a metallic groan, a sound that seemed to reverberate with their inner dread. The women began their slow, hesitant descent, each step heavy with foreboding. Their eyes darted nervously toward the line of American soldiers standing rigidly along the dock. The soldiers' uniforms were impeccably crisp, their rifles glinting ominously in the winter sun, yet there was no jeering, no shouts, no physical aggression. Instead, the soldiers simply watched, their expressions unreadable, their silence broken only by the plaintive cry of a gull circling overhead. A thin, ethereal fog clung stubbornly to the bay, enveloping the entire scene in a muted gray shroud. Yet, the scent that now drifted toward the women was not that of gunpowder or oil, but something warm, yeasty, and strangely, profoundly inviting. At the very end of the pier, long wooden tables had been meticulously set up. Upon them lay towering stacks of bread, soft, white loaves, still steaming, their golden crust splitting ever so slightly from the heat. Beside them sat massive trays laden with pork, its fat sizzling temptingly along the edges, the rich aroma curling enticingly through the damp air. For women who had endured the past 2 years on meager bowls of thin rice gruel, on pickled radish and the occasional scrap of fish, this sight was almost beyond belief, bordering on the surreal. One young nurse instinctively clutched her stomach, not from hunger, but from sheer, overwhelming disbelief. Another whispered to her companion in hushed Japanese, "It must be a trick. Such richness cannot possibly be real." Their fear, however, had not been entirely unfounded. Back in Japan, daily rations had dwindled to mere handfuls of rice, sometimes grudgingly padded with barley or millet. Meat had all but vanished from their diets, and butter and milk were luxuries so rare as to be almost mythical. For years, the Empire's propaganda machine had thundered relentlessly, portraying American soldiers as merciless monsters who would beat and starve prisoners until they begged for the sweet release of death. In occupied cities across Asia, these very women had witnessed firsthand how Japanese forces treated Allied captives, skeletal men behind barbed wire, their eyes hollow, their bodies visibly broken. They had, therefore, assumed that Americans would repay cruelty with an equal measure of barbarism. And so, as they walked toward the tables, their steps faltered as if the soft bread itself might conceal a hidden weapon. An American sergeant, a figure of authority, gestured firmly but without a hint of unkindness. "Line up here," he instructed, his voice low and steady, his words translated quickly by a bilingual Red Cross aide. The women formed a hesitant queue, the rhythmic sound of their heels and sandals on the wooden boards echoing like small drum beats, each step bringing them closer to a confrontation they were utterly unprepared to face. Their eyes remained fixated on the bread, so soft, so pale, so impossibly abundant. It seemed to mock the dire shortages that plagued their distant homeland. One middle-aged mother, who had tragically buried a son, just the year before, felt tears rise unbidden at the agonizing thought that her remaining children, back in Yokohama, would never know such abundance. When the first woman finally reached the table, a corporal offered her a tray bearing a thick slice of bread and a generous cut of pork. She froze. Her hands trembled, suspended in midair, as though merely touching the food would betray her country or her deeply ingrained pride. The corporal nodded once, a gesture of gentle encouragement. With a sudden gasp, almost a sob, she accepted the plate. She did not eat immediately. Instead, she brought it close, inhaling deeply, allowing the overwhelming scent of roasted fat and warm flour to consume her senses. Then, slowly, almost reverently, she bit into the bread. Her eyes widened. She chewed, swallowed, and for the first time since boarding the transport ship weeks earlier, allowed herself to truly believe that she might not, in fact, die in captivity. The line moved forward steadily. Each woman served in turn. Some devoured their food greedily, stuffing mouthfuls into their cheeks as if it might vanish at any moment. Others ate with slow, delicate care, tasting each bite as though to memorize its fleeting flavor. Conversations broke out in hushed whispers. Astonishment, confusion, and even bursts of nervous laughter began to bubble up. One nurse remarked quietly, "If this is prison food, what then do free Americans eat?" Her words, translated to a nearby guard, elicited a faint smile, though no verbal reply was offered. As they ate, the women began to notice other telling details. The camp buses, waiting patiently to transport them, were remarkably clean, their engines idling softly, almost imperceptibly. American medics stood nearby, holding warm blankets, meticulously checking for any signs of illness. Red Cross workers, some women themselves, others wearing armbands with a bold red cross stitched clearly across them, moved among the captives, distributing milk in pristine glass bottles, the rich cream visibly floating at the top. The Japanese women held these bottles with an almost incredulous disbelief. Milk had been entirely absent from their diets for months, and here it was, offered casually, even to prisoners. The irony stung, yet it also offered a strange, unexpected comfort. Still, not all suspicion melted away immediately. Some women muttered darkly that this generosity was merely a facade, a brief moment of kindness before harsher, more brutal realities would inevitably emerge. Others clung desperately to the belief that the Americans intended to fatten them up before subjecting them to forced labor, or something even worse. Yet, the bread remained warm and substantial in their hands, the pork rich and savory on their tongues, its undeniable presence a powerful counter-narrative. For many, this was the very first time the propaganda meticulously instilled by their empire faltered, the first seed of doubt planted in soil long hardened by pervasive fear. One young woman, no older than 22, later recorded in her memoir that she felt as though she had quite literally stepped into another world. "I thought they would starve us," she wrote. "Instead, they fed us more in one meal than I had eaten in 3 days. The bread was soft. The pork was heavy. I wanted to hate it, but I could not." Her poignant words perfectly captured the essence of that pivotal moment. The jarring collision between fearful expectation and comforting reality, between ingrained terror and unexpected abundance, between the imagined enemy and the undeniable truth of food freely given. As dusk settled, the buses carried the women inland toward the camps that would house them for the duration of the war. The distant city lights of San Francisco glowed with an electric brilliance unimaginable in their own darkened, ration-bound homeland. Some pressed their foreheads against the windows, watching silently, while in their laps they still clutched precious bits of bread wrapped carefully in napkins, unwilling to relinquish the symbol that had so utterly upended everything they thought they knew. The engines rumbled, the convoy moving slowly into the deepening night. Behind them lay years of relentless indoctrination and gnawing hunger. Ahead, the unknown contours of captivity. Somewhere deep in the hushed silence, One woman whispered a single line that cut through the bus like a sharpened blade. "If this is how the enemy treats us, what else have they lied to us about?" And with that profound question, the conflict sharpened dramatically. It was no longer a battle of bullets and bombs, but a struggle over belief itself. A clash between the stories they had been fed and the tangible bread they now held in their hands. The first night in the camp was restless. The women lay on narrow bunks, surprisingly outfitted with clean sheets, yet sleep eluded them. Some clutched tiny crumbs of bread, carefully wrapped in napkins and hidden beneath their pillows like sacred relics. Others whispered in hushed tones, their voices thick with disbelief. The Americans had given them pork and fresh bread. The taste still lingered, rich and heavy, deeply unsettling in its sheer generosity. They wondered if morning would strip away this fragile illusion. At dawn, the sharp rattle of a bell echoed across the compound. The women rose, folding their blankets with practiced precision, bracing themselves for the harsh routines and privations they imagined were surely to come. Guards escorted them to a long wooden hall where a scent met them before the sight did. The intoxicating aroma of coffee, the rich smell of butter, and bacon fat crisping enticingly on hot iron pans. The women froze again. How, they wondered, could this possibly be a prison? The hall was lined with long tables, sunlight pouring in through wide windows, illuminating trays stacked high with food, scrambled eggs, thick slices of ham, bowls of oatmeal with sugar sprinkled liberally on top. More loaves of bread waited, their surfaces gleaming faintly with butter that had melted into golden pools. Glass pitchers of milk and orange juice stood in neat, inviting rows. For women who had spent months eating little more than rationed rice or pickled vegetables, this sheer abundance bordered on the surreal. One nurse, only 25 years old, gripped her tray so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She had once worked in a Tokyo hospital where wounded soldiers begged desperately for food she simply could not give them. Now, standing in line, she fought back tears as an American cook cheerfully ladled eggs onto her plate. Her hunger screamed within her, yet a stubborn pride held her still. She forced herself to bow slightly, murmuring a hesitant "thank you" in halting English. The cook smiled faintly and nodded, moving promptly to the next person. Seated at the long tables, the women hesitated once more. It felt like a test, as though the Americans were subtly measuring how quickly they would abandon their ingrained restraint. Then, hunger triumphed decisively. Spoons scraped against ceramic, bread was torn apart by trembling fingers, bacon cracked audibly between eager teeth. The heavy silence of the hall was broken by muffled gasps, by sighs that sounded almost like profound relief. One woman suddenly laughed, shaking her head in astonishment. "We were told they would give us nothing," she whispered, "but they give us too much." Facts would later confirm what their senses already knew. American camps provided rations, averaging nearly 3,000 calories a day. Pork, beef, milk, butter, potatoes, a variety of fresh vegetables, all drawn from the overflowing warehouses of robust U.S. agriculture. In wartime Japan, the average civilian barely survived on less than half of that. Even rice, the very foundation of their diet, was scarce, often replaced by sweet potatoes, millet, or chestnuts ground into a coarse flour. Meat was almost mythical. Children in Tokyo could not even imagine what butter tasted like. Now, their mothers were spreading it thick across soft bread in a prison thousands of miles away. The Red Cross regularly inspected these camps, filing meticulous reports that consistently spoke of abundant food, well-prepared meals, and humane conditions. The Japanese women did not see the paperwork, but they tasted its undeniable truth in every single bite. Each meal carried not only vital nourishment, but also a stinging insult to the fabricated stories they had been told. Their empire had vehemently insisted that Americans were a cruel people, utterly incapable of mercy. Yet here, rich butter was melting across their tongues. Still, suspicion lingered, an insidious undercurrent. Some whispered that this apparent generosity was a sophisticated trap, that once their bellies softened with comfort, A brutal punishment would surely follow. Others feared actual poison, though each bite taken without consequence slowly, inexorably, eroded that fear. And slowly, imperceptibly, the sturdy walls of belief began to crack. The women watched the guards eating the very same food, saw the cooks laugh together as they worked, and gradually realized that this abundance was no mere performance. This was simply America, its farmlands overflowing, its prisoners fed because it possessed the means and capacity to feed them. For Ko, the profound transformation came quietly, subtly. She recalled her last day in Tokyo before deployment. When she had queued for 2 agonizing hours to buy a mere handful of barley, her mother apologizing with a deeply bowed head for serving nothing but thin, watery soup. Now, she'd been a thick bread so soft it seemed almost decadent, and she could not help but wonder what her family would think if they could see her. She carefully set aside half her slice, wrapping it meticulously in a napkin to keep. It was not waste. It was proof, something tangible she might one day show them. The emotional weight grew heavier at night when hunger no longer gnawed and the women could reflect in the quiet intimacy of the barracks. Quiet conversations blossomed. One widow, her voice soft, said, "If they treat enemies this way, perhaps they are not devils after all." Another shook her head, unwilling to surrender her deep-seated loyalty to propaganda, yet utterly unable to dismiss the overwhelming evidence before her. Their conflict was not with rifles or bayonets, but with the bread itself, which so eloquently mocked the lies they had been fed for years. And yet, amidst the solemnity, unexpected moments of humor flickered. One morning, an American guard passed by as a woman tried to sip milk for the very first time in years. A pristine white mustache of cream clung to her upper lip, and she frowned, unsure whether to lick it away or simply wipe it. The guard chuckled softly, and she glared, initially offended, before reluctantly breaking into a small smile. Even in the depths of captivity, absurdity found its undeniable way in. The cultural shock extended far beyond mere abundance. Bread, an unfamiliar staple to many, felt foreign and surprisingly heavy in their stomachs. Some longed deeply for rice, for miso soup, for the comforting flavors that spoke profoundly of home. But hunger, the great equalizer, erased such boundaries. A nurse remarked that the bread tasted simultaneously of strangeness and profound comfort. Pork, too, was bewildering. Some ate it hesitantly, their stomachs unaccustomed to such richness, while others devoured it with an almost frantic intensity, as though attempting to reclaim years of agonizing deprivation. Hunger became the great equalizer. Every mealtime, the same astonishing scene repeated itself. Trays laden with an unimaginable array of food, guards gently urging them to take more, the profound disbelief of captives who were prepared for torment and instead receive an abundance beyond their wildest dreams. What unsettled them most was not the distant possibility of cruelty, but the undeniable, visceral evidence of kindness. That profound contradiction pressed harder than hunger ever had. By midwinter, their bodies began to undergo a noticeable transformation. Hollow cheeks filled out, shoulders straightened, and a healthy color returned to faces once pale with fatigue. Strength stirred in limbs that had grown weak from prolonged undernourishment. The women noticed these changes and marveled. Captivity, ironically, had restored them more than freedom in Japan ever could. Yet, this realization came with a heavy burden of shame, for they still considered themselves loyal daughters of their empire. To admit that the enemy cared for them better than their own homeland did was to betray something far deeper than mere pride. At night, Ko often found herself staring intently at the piece of bread she had hidden away. She would not eat it, though it hardened and grew stale with time. It became a powerful symbol, a constant reminder that the world was not as simple as she had been taught. She turned it over and over in her hands, feeling the immense weight of change pressing against her chest. One evening, as the women settled into their bunks, a distant whistle blew across the camp, signaling lights out. In the quiet darkness, a voice whispered, almost trembling. If they can feed us like this, what else might they do that we cannot possibly imagine? The words hung heavy in the still air, laden with both palpable fear and tantalizing possibility. The nature of the conflict had shifted once more. No longer was it about whether they would starve, but about whether they could continue believing the Empire's elaborate stories at all. Winter settled heavily over the camp, but the women soon realized the physical cold here was gentler than the chilling fear they had carried inside them. Their apprehension, like frost on a window pane, slowly melted away as daily life unfolded with routines they had simply not expected. Meals arrived with such unwavering consistency that hunger became a distant memory rather than a constant, gnawing companion. Clean water flowed freely from taps. Showers steamed at the mere pull of a handle. Blankets, though coarse, were warm enough to make the barracks feel almost safe, almost comforting. Each small detail contradicted the dire warnings they had heard back home. Each unexpected kindness struck harder than any cruelty ever could. Yet, what unsettled them most was not the abundant food or the comfortable bedding, but the quiet dignity with which they were consistently treated. American guards barked orders to maintain schedules, yes, but they never struck. Punishments were rare, discipline measured, and even in silence, the atmosphere carried no discernible malice. The women slowly began to look at the soldiers differently. Their boots were polished, their uniforms crisp, but their faces were young, often etched with weariness, and sometimes even shy in the presence of women they had been explicitly told were enemies. News trickled into the camp through hushed whispers and occasional Red Cross bulletins. They heard of Japanese camps in the Philippines and on the Chinese mainland where American prisoners wasted away on meager rations and endured brutal beatings that left them broken, physically and spiritually. They thought of those starving, bruised men and compared it starkly to their own days spent eating soft bread and rich pork under roofs that did not leak. Shame stirred in their hearts, intricately tangled with profound confusion. How could the Empire demand such unyielding loyalty when it had preached lies so easily unmasked by the simple, undeniable taste of butter melting across bread? Ko noticed it first in herself. She caught her reflection in a tin mirror one morning and was startled by the healthy color in her cheeks, the slight roundness returning to her face. Her uniform had grown less loose around her waist. She looked, she realized with a jolt, healthier than she had in years. This knowledge deeply unsettled her. Was it an act of betrayal to grow strong under the enemy's care, or was it simply the undeniable truth of survival, her body responding to reality rather than propaganda? She folded the thought away, but returned each time she touched her hidden crust of bread, now hard as stone, yet heavy with profound meaning. Christmas approached, and with it came another profound shock. On December 25th, the women were ushered into the mess hall to find tables elaborately decorated with colorful paper streamers and fragrant branches of pine. On every plate lay generous slices of turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, rich gravy, and sweet cranberry sauce, foods they had never even imagined existed. At the far end of the hall, an American soldier played a piano, stumbling good-naturedly through carols that filled the room with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. The Japanese women ate quietly, but tears ran silently down more than one face. It was not the feast itself that moved them so deeply, but the stark contradiction. They were prisoners, yet treated like honored guests on a day that held no cultural significance in their own homeland. Propaganda had simply never prepared them for kindness cloaked in such a rich, unfamiliar tradition. Some resisted still. A stern widow named Harumi reminded the younger women in hushed, urgent tones to keep their loyalty firm. "Do not be fooled," she whispered. "This is a trick to weaken us." Yet even she could not help but eat the succulent turkey, her resolve softening with each bite. Hunger made a mockery of pride, and abundance steadily eroded suspicion. Each unexpected gesture of mercy was another hammer blow against the formidable edifice of fear Japan had so painstakingly built. Guards, too, began to notice the subtle changes. One sergeant wrote in his diary, "The women are always polite, bowing, even when they do not understand what we say. But it is the bread that breaks them. They look at it as if it were treasure. I sometimes think they bow to the loaf before they bow to us." His poignant words captured what official reports could not. That food, more than rifles or bombs, was profoundly reshaping the war in their minds. The clash between propaganda and reality deepened further when American cooks, surprisingly, attempted to prepare Japanese-style meals. With patient guidance from Red Cross interpreters, they boiled rice, added soy sauce imported through neutral channels, and offered it alongside vegetables. The effort was admittedly clumsy, the flavor strange and unfamiliar, but the underlying gesture struck the women profoundly. To see the enemy attempt to prepare their own cuisine, even poorly, was an astonishing acknowledgment of their shared humanity. It left them shaken, for cruelty could be resisted, but such unexpected kindness left them utterly defenseless. Co found herself laughing one evening when a fellow nurse bit into the American rice and dramatically winced. "It tastes like porridge," the girl muttered, a comical grimace on her face. The barracks filled with stifled giggles, the sound foreign and liberating after months of oppressive solemnity. Laughter, too, was a potent weapon against fear, and it slipped through cracks that propaganda could simply not seal. The transformation was gradual, but undeniably profound. Each unexpected meal, each unforeseen gesture stripped away another tenacious layer of indoctrination. The Empire had painted Americans as brutish monsters. Yet here they were, serving fresh milk in glass bottles and smiling genuinely as they poured. The Empire had promised starvation and torment, yet the women's bodies grew stronger, their cheeks flushed with robust health. The Empire had promised endless cruelty, yet sometimes a soldier politely tipped his cap or stepped aside to allow them to pass. The women began to ask themselves a searing question. If these were the monsters, what then did that make of those who had sent them to believe such insidious lies? Still, a deep, internal conflict raged within them. Loyalty was not easily abandoned, nor was the profound shame of seeing their nation exposed as weaker and less humane than the very enemy they had been taught to despise. Each unexpected kindness, paradoxically, deepened the wound, forcing them to wrestle with unbearable truths they simply could not reconcile. The younger women, more adaptable, embraced the abundance with relatively open hearts. The older ones held tighter to suspicion, though their formidable defenses visibly cracked with each passing week. In the quiet of the barracks, Ko often closed her eyes and vividly remembered the gaunt faces of starving soldiers she had once nursed in Tokyo. She thought of their hollow cheeks, their desperate whispers begging for food, their deaths unmarked by any comfort. Then she opened her eyes to see her fellow captives, their faces now full and healthy. The captives ate pork chops larger than their hands and drank milk until their bellies were full. This contrast, stark against the scarcity she imagined in Tokyo, gnawed at her. Her empire demanded loyalty, but the bread demanded honesty. Which was stronger? One cold January evening, as snow softly dusted the ground outside, a guard delivered unexpected news. The women would soon be permitted to write letters home, a revelation that sent gasps rippling through the barracks. For the first time since capture, a fragile thread back to Japan seemed possible, but the announcement carried unspoken, heavy weight. What would they write? Could they tell their families the truth, that they ate better in prison than free people did in Tokyo? Or would they repeat the empire's lies, protecting pride even as they betrayed their own senses? The women sat in stunned silence, staring at the blank paper and pencils laid before them. The conflict sharpened again, no longer between hunger and abundance, but between truth and loyalty. The scratch of the first pen echoed like thunder in the quiet hall, each word a choice between the world they had been promised and the world they now truly lived in. Spring thawed the camp slowly, snow giving way to damp earth and resilient patches of grass that pushed stubbornly through the soil. By now, The women no longer flinched at the clang of the morning bell or the sight of guards at the gates. Life had settled into a rhythm they could navigate. Meals served at precise times, routine chores and inspections, and moments of leisure spent sewing or walking the perimeter. The initial strangeness had not vanished, but had softened into familiarity. What had once seemed a cruel trick now felt almost ordinary. And it was in that very ordinariness that the true transformation revealed itself. Ko, who had once hidden that first crust of bread as if it were a sacred relic, found herself one afternoon holding a fresh slice without trembling. She no longer felt the need to wrap bread away to prove its existence. She simply ate, savoring without guilt. The act startled her. She realized she had crossed a significant boundary, not only in body, but in belief. Something inside her had yielded, not to propaganda or fear, but to simple reality. She was alive, she was stronger, and she had to admit it was the Americans who had made it so. Letters home, when finally permitted, became intricate confessions written in careful half-truths. Many women could not bear to admit they were well-fed, fearing it would sound like betrayal to families surviving on meager scraps. They wrote instead of long days and persistent uncertainty, glossing over the unexpected abundance. Yet between the lines, hints of contradiction slipped through. "We are treated fairly," one woman cautiously wrote. Another confessed, "I eat enough to feel full." Their families in Japan, ration books in hand, could scarcely believe such claims. Rumors spread that captivity in America was, paradoxically, preferable to freedom at home. By the summer of 1944, the women's bodies bore undeniable witness to their transformation. Photographs taken by inspectors show them standing in orderly rows, their cheeks filled, their eyes alert. They no longer looked like prisoners starved into submission, but women restored by strange fortune. A guard remarked in his logbook, "They walk with more confidence now, almost proud." If not for the uniforms, one could mistake them for guests rather than captives. The irony was bitter. The empire that had demanded their loyalty could not feed them, while the enemy they had been taught to despise had nourished them back to health. The psychological battle grew sharper. Harumi, the stern widow, clung longest to suspicion, warning others not to soften. Yet even she could not resist the subtle pull of reality. One day, she caught herself laughing at a joke a young soldier made as he attempted to carry too many trays and nearly spilled milk across the floor. She quickly covered her mouth, ashamed, but the sound had escaped nonetheless. The moment haunted her. Was it treachery to laugh with the enemy? Or was it simply proof that humanity ran deeper than propaganda could reach? Kiko, too, wrestled with profound shame. She dreamed of her mother waiting in line for barley, of soldiers dying on mats with empty stomachs. At times, guilt knifed through her so sharply that she refused second helpings, trying to atone in small ways. But the truth was undeniable. She had been fed, clothed, and treated with dignity. The empire had painted America as cruel. Yet here she stood, flesh returning to her frame and strength in her limbs. What frightened her most was not the enemy's power, but its unsettling mercy. Mercy, she realized, left no defense. The climax came quietly, not in battle or confrontation, but in a letter read aloud one autumn evening. A young woman named Aiko had written to her sister in Kyoto and, without caution, told the unvarnished truth. "Do not fear for me. I am safe. They feed us bread every day, pork and milk. Sometimes I think we're eating better than you." Weeks later, the letter returned censored and marked. The women passed it from hand to hand, reading the words before the black ink of censorship struck them out. For a moment, silence filled the barracks. Then, one by one, they looked up at each other, their eyes wide with the same dawning realization. Aiko had spoken aloud the words they all carried inside. America's abundance, they now understood, was not a trick but a reality, and it had irrevocably broken the empire's lies. The emotional shift was irreversible. They still longed for home, still bowed when required, and still whispered doubts in the dark. But in their hearts, something fundamental had changed. They no longer believed every word their leaders had told them. The bread had undone more than just hunger. It had irrevocably undone obedience. Each slice was an argument stronger than propaganda. Each meal, a silent sermon about the nature of power. America had conquered them not with rifles, but with pork chops and loaves of bread. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the announcement reached the camp through a crackling loudspeaker. Japan had surrendered. The women wept, not only for defeat, but for relief, for the end of uncertainty, for the chance to return to families who might now not recognize them. Repatriation ships waited to carry them home. But departure was bittersweet. They had entered captivity expecting cruelty and left it carrying the bewildering memory of kindness. Ko, standing on the deck as her ship pulled away from the American coast, looked down at the ocean spray and thought of the first slice of bread she had ever tasted. She realized it would haunt her more intensely than the gun barrels or the fences. That bread had forced her to see the world not as propaganda demanded, but as it truly was, and she wondered how she would explain this complex truth to her mother, who might never taste such softness again. In later years, some of these women spoke of their captivity not as torment, but as a profound revelation. They told their children and grandchildren of a sheer shock they felt when handed pork and fresh bread by the very soldiers they feared most. They described the jarring clash between expectation and reality, how their loyalty cracked not under cruelty, but under the unsettling force of mercy. Their memories became quiet testimonies, undeniable proof that wars are not only fought with bullets, but with the daily choices of how captives are treated. Yet, the legacy of their experience was far more intricate than simple gratitude. It was, rather, a haunting, indelible recognition that America's unexpected abundance had humbled them more profoundly than any of its formidable weapons ever could. They had indeed survived, yes, but that very survival carried its own unique existential burden. For embedded within that survival lay the unsettling question that relentlessly followed them home. Why had the enemy cared for them better than their own nation did? Years later, when Ko had become an old woman, she was asked what single moment had changed her most profoundly during the war. She spoke not of the deafening bombs, nor the brutal battles, nor even the arduous, long ocean voyage. She simply said, the bread. She elaborated, I thought they would starve us, but they gave us bread. That was the day everything I believed began to fall apart. Her words echo across history, a poignant reminder that sometimes the most devastating weapon is not destruction, but profound generosity, not terror, but food freely given. And as the ship carrying the last of these women finally vanished over the horizon in 1945, the profound question lingered in the air, a shadow cast across the nascent peace. If the enemy could offer bread in the crucible of war, what boundless possibilities might truly exist in a world striving for peace?